Hi, I'm your friendly neighborhood microbiologist, and I want to talk to you today about spillover events, which are how animal viruses jump into humans and sometimes they cause pandemics. I'm Kelly Cowan from Miami University, and I'm the author of two microbiology textbooks, one of which you may be using, pictured here. And if you are using one of these, then some of the figures I'm going to be showing you, you can look up in there as well. So, spillover events. Let's talk about some historical spillover events first. The painting that I have pictured here is from the 1300s, and during the 1300s, 12 ships from the Black Sea docked in Sicily in southern Europe, and the passengers there were infected with the plague, also called the Black Death. And over the next 5 years, in the 1300s, over 30 million people in Europe were killed by the Black Death. And that constituted between a third and a half of the continent's population. So it was a big deal. And it was a spillover event, which was not appreciated until later, because what they did with these 12 ships to try to stop the spread of the disease or to prevent it is they quarantined the people on the ships. Makes sense, I guess, but what they didn't know was that the Black Death came from the fleas on rats. Well, the rats happily scurried down the gangplanks and went all over the city, all over Europe, and killed these 30 million people. All right, so a little bit of background to get to the point of talking about spillovers. What you see here is a timeline of the planet Earth, basically, an evolutionary history on the planet. And if you look over to the left, you see that about 4.3 or 4 billion years ago is probably when the Earth was formed. Fairly soon after that, the first ancestral cell was formed. Doesn't look anything like the cells we know now. In fact, it itself is extinct. But from that cell type, and remember, this was over 4 billion years ago, the single cells that we know as bacteria and archaea were formed. So let's just stop there. And you look at those red and yellow bars, and you see that those single cells that we've been studying in this course have been around over 4 billion years. Now, the first organisms that you probably recognize, let's say insects that are on the purple bar, they just appeared a little less than 1 billion years ago. So for 3 billion years, these single-celled organisms were all there was on Earth. And then if you look at the very top, how long have humans been here on this time scale? It's just the blink of an eye, relatively speaking. So what's my point? My point is that these single-celled organisms, which cause disease, not all of them, in fact, the minority of them cause disease, but when they do, they are so adapted to life on Earth and to living with every other organism that came way after they came, that we have to learn how to live with them and not how to exterminate all of them. That's one of my points. My other point is that around the time that archaea and bacteria came around is probably also the time that viruses evolved and became what we think of as organisms. So they've been around for billions and billions of years as well. So they, in evolutionary time, we can think of them as having much more experience surviving, clearly, than we as humans do. Okay, so let's move on a little bit and talk about zoonoses. You know that zoo means animal. Zoonoses are infections that start out in animals but can also infect humans. So many of these are familiar, like let's look at Rabies, for instance, comes from dogs when they're not vaccinated, raccoons, skunks, and can infect humans if those animals are sick with rabies and are intimately close to humans, such as their saliva getting in your eyes or a bite, which is most familiar to most people. That is the definition of a zoonosis. Now, that happens all the time. We know a lot of zoonotic diseases, but a spillover event is a little bit different. It's when one of these diseases is transmitted to a human, and then the human is capable of transmitting it to other humans. So that last step, human-to-human transmission, is not always possible, but it can be. I'm going to introduce another concept, which is One Health. It is being widely adopted by the scientific community, and it's pretty simple, really, and should be obvious that what happens to animals, what happens to plants and the rest of the environment, and what humans do and how close they get to these animals and what they do to the environment will impact whether we share our viruses and other microorganisms with one another. So instead of taking each circle here as separate, veterinarians deal with the animals and ecologists deal with the plants and doctors deal with humans, we really need to consider the whole continuum. We have the concept of weather. Now, you could say that weather is included in the environment, and it is, but I want to highlight it here to make sure we pay special attention to what the weather does in this ongoing cycle. We're having a lot of weather disruptions lately. For instance, there's a drought going on in the southwest United States, and it's said to be the worst drought in 1,200 years. So not since 800 AD has there been a drought that's been this bad. So that's got to have an influence, definitely on nature, certainly on animals, and eventually on the health of humans. All right, here we get to the meat. The spillover event, I've already hinted about this, is when a microorganism that circulates in an animal species then becomes able to infect humans. It could be due to some mutations in that microorganism that suddenly makes it capable of infecting a new host, or via mixing of genes, which we'll say a little bit more about. You may require additional mutations for that spillover event to then result in the capability of the microorganism to be transmitted human to human. Okay, I'm going back here to my zoonoses, and let's look at influenza, which there's a red circle next to it, and its primary animal reservoirs are chickens, birds, and swine. Large pandemics of influenza frequently happen because the influenza viruses that infect birds, chickens, and the ones that infect swine end up mixing their genes together so that suddenly you've got a hybrid influenza virus that is different than any influenza virus that's ever been seen. And it can infect humans who have never seen this particular kind of influenza. They have no immunity to it, and a pandemic is caused. This is what happened in 1918 when as many as 50 million people died from the influenza pandemic. And it happens from time to time, not always with catastrophic consequences, but it sets us up for catastrophic consequences. So a couple of recent examples where there was a spillover event that then resulted in pandemics. You remember Ebola, which was a major concern, started in 2014 in Africa and spread fairly quickly in Africa. And we even had some concern here in the United States because we had air travel, etc. Viruses do not stay on a single continent or in a single state or region, as you know. Another spillover event was the Zika virus epidemic, which occurred mainly in the Americas and the Pacific Islands, but this is a virus carried by mosquitoes that suddenly started manifesting as a birth defect for the fetuses in pregnant women who were infected. And it resulted in microcephaly in the children who were born to many infected mothers. So the mosquitoes carried the virus, and mosquitoes' habitat, of course, is greatly affected by temperature of the area, which can be affected by weather, which can be affected by many other things. So those are examples of two spillover events. One very clear example of a tragic spillover event is HIV/AIDS. And this is a picture of the AIDS quilt displayed in Washington, D.C. I know you know a lot about this disease. Maybe you don't remember that when it first hit the human population in very large numbers, it was terrifying because it was literally a death sentence. A very slow, lingering death occurred if you were infected with HIV. As of 2018, 700,000 people in the United States have died of HIV/AIDS, and nearly 13,000 people experience AIDS in the United States and die each year. So let's look at what's happening. The first U.S. cases were in 1981. As I said, it was a virtual death sentence. The course of the disease, if it is not effectively treated, is that you become infected, it invades your blood cells, causes temporary inflammation and flu-like symptoms, but then goes quiet for 5 to 10 years. Now, it's not quiet inside your body because the virus is busy destroying T cells, which in turn slowly destroys your ability to respond to infection, many infections. And the infections start popping up, let's say a decade later. And sometimes that's the first time that people will get tested and find out that they have this. And they eventually would die of one or more of these AIDS-related conditions. Finally, after frantic searches for vaccines and drugs, there were drugs developed, not a vaccine yet, so that people, if they have access to the drugs, they stopped dying in around 1996. Now, of course, as you know, there are huge health inequities across the planet and even within countries. So if you do not have access to health care or do not have access to the drugs, then you're right back in 1981, and having HIV is a death sentence still. Globally, it's mostly women and children who are affected. In the United States, women and children only make up about 23% of those with HIV, but globally, they are the majority. Since the beginning, since 1981, when the HIV pandemic began, 33 million people have died globally. And for comparison's sake, so far, as I'm recording this in February 2022, 6 million people have died of COVID. Now, granted, this is over the course of all of these years that AIDS has killed these many people, but it's had a massive impact. So what I want to do is talk to you about the spillover event that led to a massive pandemic of HIV. So first of all, HIV originated in animals as the simian immunodeficiency virus. Simian means ape, basically. So it was a virus that circulated among primates probably for decades and decades. We have no idea how long, but a very, very, very long time. At some point, there was a spillover event where the virus moved from primates into humans. It's widely thought that that was due to the hunting of primates as bushmeat. I think I talked about during the One Health discussion that the behavior and the cultural practices of humans has a lot to do with spillover events. So in certain parts of Africa and in other places as well, all over Asia, for instance, wild animals are caught butchered and sold in markets or eaten by the families of people who caught them or shot them or killed them as sustenance, as protein sustenance, as meat. So it's thought that butchering an infected monkey who happened to harbor a simian immunodeficiency virus that had a mutation that made it capable of infecting humans led to the first HIV infections, human immunodeficiency virus infection. Now, things didn't explode right away in the human population. Some cultural occurrences had an influence. The spillover event probably took place in the early 1900s, say the 1920s. Okay, but the AIDS epidemic didn't start until 1981. So between the 1920s and 1981, things were happening that favored the evolution of the virus to become more deadly, more virulent. One of those common things that causes such a thing to happen is quick societal change. We think that the spillover event itself occurred in Cameroon in the upper left-hand side of my red circle in Africa, which was very close to a city that had quickly, during the late 1800s and early 1900s, had become the center of commerce and transportation, railways, etc. So the city was growing quickly because of the transportation routes, railways and highways. There were a lot of cultural changes, such as men traveling far away from their homes to work in the new industry, constructing new cities, to drive the trucks. And under those circumstances, a lot of times prostitution arises. So over the course of these 60-some years, this virus was being transmitted with not horribly noticeable effects, human to human. The urbanization continued. Sexual partner exchange rate increased greatly in these new urban areas. And also, because of the increased affluence in this geographical area, new immunization campaigns were occurring for smallpox, for instance, and sleeping sickness, African sleeping sickness. And at the time, you won't believe this, but at the time, it was not unusual for needles to be reused because needles and medical equipment were in short supply. And so we have massive vaccination campaigns, you reusing needles in a population of people who were more or less percolating a virus, HIV, that is very susceptible to mutation and to changing based on the conditions. With some viruses, and especially retroviruses, which are highly mutable, the main point is that the more exchange of fluids, blood, sexual fluids, then the more virulent the virus got. So this was all happening in the 60s and 70s in Central Africa. At some point, because of just normal air travel, someone who was infected with HIV brought it to San Francisco in the United States and introduced it to the gay male population, which at that time, for various cultural reasons, were engaged in high rates of partner exchange. And some of those people were also having sex with heterosexual partners. And eventually, very quickly, the virulent HIV strain exploded across the globe, resulting in the 33 million deaths that we spoke of earlier. So that's an example of how a virus spills into the human population, and then human cultural practices lead to the explosion of a pandemic. Let's zoom back out to what that means for us today. Of course, as we have become aware of these trends and aware of the biology and the genetics of these microorganisms, there are scientists who are very interested in tracking our future risk, as you can imagine. So let's talk about that a minute. Right now we know that there are approximately 250 zoonotic viruses that can jump from an animal to a human. So there's a group of scientists, a very large group of scientists, who have traveled to 30 countries to study rainforests, because rainforests are an area of very rich biodiversity where most of these undescribed viruses are probably hiding out. So they've gone to 30 countries and they have discovered over 500,000 viruses, new viruses, in 75,000 animals, and using a very complex rubric which they have created with what they've learned about other spillover viruses. They've ranked the top 50 new viruses with respect to spillover potential. It might come as no surprise that 16 out of the top 50 are in fact coronaviruses. Now, the problem with this is, as we said before, that the sudden increased contact of humans with these viruses is one of the leading ways to instigate a spillover event. Well, you may or may not be aware, but 64% of the world's tropical rainforests are gone because of human cultural practices, because of poverty, because of the need to feed one's families or to engage in larger agricultural endeavors. People have cut down the rainforests, which leads people deeper into the forests, which leads people into more frequent contact with animals of the forest. And also the deforestation leads to climate change, increased climate change, so that it all has a cyclical and detrimental effect where spillover viruses are concerned. Let's talk about SARS-CoV-2, or the current COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to work backwards for how SARS-CoV-2 spilled over into the human population. We are all familiar by now with the fact that this virus originated in Wuhan, China, where my blue star is here in the country of China. But why suddenly did it just start making humans very sick and killing humans very quickly? Well, it was because of a spillover event. We're not sure yet which animal from a wildlife market, which wildlife markets, sometimes called wet markets, they're not exactly the same, but doesn't matter for our purposes. Wildlife of all kinds, snakes, alligators, rats, monkeys, civets, are sold in large parts of the world, and all of Asia has a large number of wildlife markets. And we've already talked about how viruses from wildlife can quickly spill over into humans, and that was the spillover event. We do know that the virus itself, SARS-CoV-2, probably originated in bats, and the bats transferred the virus into the animal. The animal was transported to wildlife markets in Wuhan, where it spilled over into a human and then started its human-to-human transmission. Each of those events probably requiring a mutation. And as you know from the number of variants we have of this virus, that the mutations are very, very common in the coronaviruses. Why do the bats have these coronaviruses in the first place? Well, look to the bottom left corner of China. You will see that on the border between Laos and Myanmar, and in southwestern China there, the tropical forests that are native there had been increasingly replaced by woodlands. Areas that we're familiar with in North America, for example. But increases in temperature, are you paying attention? Increases in temperature, sunlight, and carbon dioxide fostered the growth of savanna and deciduous trees and woodlands. This is a habitat that is highly favored by bats. So within a decade or so, 40 new bat species occurred in these woodland areas of southwestern China and the countries bordering it. And bats are notorious for mixing viruses among one another. There are so many different bat species, and each bat species, on average, has 2 different viruses, coronaviruses in particular. And when they get together in the same host, they will mix up their genes or cause mutations and be totally different viruses, and maybe spill over from a bat to an animal, and then mutate and spill over from an animal to humans. And then another mutation makes it human to human transmissible. And all of a sudden, you've got an explosion like we've seen over less than 3 years around the globe of human to human transmission of SARS-CoV-2. I think we can see the influence of weather that influences the content, the makeup of vegetation, and humans changing that vegetation by either chopping it down or living in it for the first time, and animals picking up viruses they didn't previously have. And this cycle just continues to encourage mutation of viruses that will continue to be appearing in the human population. The concept of One Health. Now, just one little postscript here, and that is that there's also a concept known as spillback, where humans, once they've transmitted a virus amongst themselves for some period of time, could be days, could be decades, those viruses can then spill back into animals that previously did not experience that virus. And right now, with SARS-CoV-2, we see that happening most prominently in mink farms, M-I-N-K, mink farms. Hundreds and thousands of minks have been found to be infected with SARS-CoV-2, and those minks transmitting it to wild minks have transmitted it to white-tailed deer. So right now we know of at least 2 animal species that didn't have SARS-CoV-2 before that now have SARS-CoV-2 because they've caught it from us, and that's called spillback. And that's a summary of how spillover can happen affecting human populations and how everything in our environment has an influence. So that's the end, but it's probably not the end. Thank you very much.